Welcome back to the Goldmark Gallery and another exhibition of printmaking mastery here, this time from the French giant Henri Matisse. Matisse was an artist who saw some of the most extraordinary developments in art across the 20th century. He lived through the last years of Impressionism, right the way through to the 1950s, saw both world wars and produced work that would itself change the way that we thought about and viewed art. Printmaking was hugely important to Matisse. In a period of over 50 years, he made some 800 prints in a number of different mediums, from this fantastic loose line in this lino cut here to etchings, engravings, woodcuts, lithographs, and the fantastic reproductions of his magnificent last paper cutouts. Printmaking was for him a sort of a personal process. It was very intimate. It was a way of exploring and developing ideas that came out of sketching. Often his prints have a very free, loose line. They were a kind of way of release from the other work that he was doing in his career. In this exhibition, we're going to see some of that. We're going to see the extraordinary simplicity, the incredible spontaneity which he brought to the world of print. And we're going to see how Matisse found a visual language that was unparalleled, really, in the first half of the 20th century. I hope you enjoy. For the European artists like Matisse in the early 20th century, printmaking was a way of bringing their art to a broader public, of making works that were in a way more democratic, that more people could possibly own and enjoy themselves. And it's partly for that reason that we can now enjoy the works of Matisse when enormous paintings, murals, the last cutouts from his last years are confined to museum walls. But it was also for him a way of getting away from a lot of that larger work, from finding a kind of refuge in the smaller scale of printmaking. And that's precisely what this little etching was all about. This is a study plate. It's an etching that was not originally published, and it was made as part of a number of illustrations that Matisse made to accompany poems by Stéphane Mallarmé. This was a suite called Poésie, and it was published in 1932 by Albert Schirin, who was a publisher who Matisse worked with a number of times in his life. At the time, Matisse was dealing with a difficult commission. He was making a large mural that he was struggling with. Miscalculations about the size of the wall meant that he'd had to work sort of very much at pace. And in the 3 years before, he'd had a difficult period in his life. He'd found much of his celebrity had been ceded to Picasso and the Surrealists in Paris. He found that nothing was quite inspiring him. He'd travelled to the South Seas, to Tahiti. He'd made tours around that area, loved the exotic life, but came away without any real sort of inspiration in his work. So this was an opportunity for him to withdraw, to develop some ideas, to get down on his etching plates some of the things that he was thinking about. This is, I think, a really beautiful print. It was actually issued by the Matisse Foundation in 1987, so over 50 years, half a century after it was made. It was one of a number of study plates that the foundation released. And really, it shows that Matisse's style was sort of almost the exact opposite of Mallarmé's poetry. Mallarmé's work was fragmentary, it was obscure and often obtuse. It's virtually impossible to translate into English. Compare that with the beautiful, clear, lucid line of this print, these wonderful, languid odalisques that show Matisse's love of the female form, the curves, the contours. It's in a plate like this where, rare among Matisse's printed works, you can see him actually exploring the ideas that would come to fruition, the ideas that would finally conclude in the final portfolio. That's why we see sort of a number of these different images almost overlapping. It was Matisse getting his line down, getting his hand in, seeing where his eye and his hand were taking him. It's a wonderful foil to the poems in the portfolio. It has this wonderful sort of clearness, this lovely sort of ethereal quality that sort of matched the poems, but also contrasted with their sort of difficult language. But it also gets to the heart of what printmaking meant for Matisse. Printmaking and poetry for him went hand in hand, and he likened poetry to oxygen and printmaking to sketching, two tonics for the soul. In the 1940s onwards, in the latter years of his life, in his sort of 70s and 80s, he made a number of suites that dealt with poetry, that made illustrations for poetry. And that's what you see in these portraits here. You can see again, though these are lithographs and not etchings, that this is, again, that wonderful clear line, that very simple, fluid, flowing line that he's captured in these portraits. These were made in 1945, and they were illustrations, again, to accompany another poet's work, a contemporary poet this time, Jean-Antoine Nau. Nau's poems were drawing on the landscape of the islands in the Caribbean and this sort of exotic allure. And this was something that Matisse was very aware of. He had himself travelled to Morocco, and he had a particular love of sort of the heat and the vibrant colour of the old French colonies. He enlisted the help of a number of Polynesian models for this series, and the idea was to really capture the sort of sensuousness of their facial structure, to in these very simple portraits, get that kind of feeling of freedom and relaxation, of sort of leisure, of luxury, of this wonderful sort of heady quality in the place described in the poems. I think they're really beautiful prints. They've got, I think, a wonderful sensuousness, a kind of lust for life. And you would think they were made by a young man at the height of his virility. But in fact, Matisse produced these lithographs at a time when he was perhaps at his frailest, his most ill, his most incapacitated. It was a hugely dark time during his life. Matisse suffered from ill health throughout his life. The abdominal pains that he'd been feeling often throughout his later years had come to a breaking point in the late 1930s, in the years before the war. And by December 1940, it flared up so seriously that he found himself in a hospital in Nice, practically on his deathbed with his assistant by his side. His troubles had been wrongly attributed to his heart, but he discovered in hospital that he had intestinal cancer. He didn't trust the surgeons in Nice, so calling his daughter to his bedside, they conspired to move him to Lyon. This was a 12-hour train journey in the depths of winter through occupied French territory during the Second World War to get him to Lyon. Matisse arrived at the hospital practically unable to move with the pain and underwent very intensive bouts of surgery. While the surgery was successful, the aftermath was not. His surgical wounds soon became infected, and he suffered from 2 clots in his lungs in the weeks after. It was an intensely difficult time for him and his family, and he thought that this was probably the end. By March, however, somehow, miraculously, he had pulled through. The nuns who were on the ward in the hospital that helped look after him referred to him as le ressuscité, the man who had come back from the dead. He was now working on borrowed time, and boy did he know it. In the weeks immediately after his surgery, Matisse spent much of that time in a sort of state of feverish delirium. He seemed to change between periods of lucidity and almost babbling nonsense. But one thing that emerged from this very difficult time, this realization of his mortality, what little time he had left ahead of him, was that printmaking was one of the things he wanted to turn to as part of an extension of his drawing, to return to the simple drawn line. He spent the months of 1941 confined virtually his entire time to his bed or to his chair. And in fact, there's some wonderful photographs of him sat up in bed, drawing on the walls of his studio in the south of France with a giant bamboo stick with charcoal on the end in order to reach the height of his walls. During that time, immediately after his surgery, as a kind of revitalization, a way of getting back into the world of art, he turned to a print series that he had envisaged, a suite of lithographs called the Florilège des Amours, illustrating the love poems of Ronsard. Love poetry was one of the things to which he would turn a number of times in these years after the war, a way of getting back into this sort of something full of life and full of beauty and vitality. This is one of those lithographs, and the images in this suite really draw on all of the imagery that Matisse had built up over his life, the themes with which he was so familiar now that he could almost draw them straight onto the block without thinking. Bouquets of flowers, female nude figures, faces, portraits of friends, of the many models that he'd worked with, of his family members. It was a kind of love letter to the simple drawn line, to the sort of lyrical quality of poetry, which he could capture in the way that he put his pen, or his, in this case, his lithographic crayon, to the block. With the continued Nazi occupation of France, Matisse soon decided to move from Nice and stay permanently in his studio in Vence, in nearby south of France. Here he was in the aptly named Villa Le Rêve, his dream home. And it was here that he would not only return to printmaking in general, to drawing, to sketching, as he found it more and more difficult to paint, but also that he would return to perhaps the most important part of his later career, the papiers découpés, or the cutouts. Matisse had actually first explored the idea of the cutout long before the Second World War. He'd first developed it as a way of working out mural designs, using large pieces of paper cut to the places that he was working with. He could very quickly move his designs in situ. He could alter them, alter the line of them. It was a very quick and economical way of seeing what was going to work and what wasn't. From that idea, though, he returned to it more and more in the later 1930s, and he found in it a genre that almost didn't exist. This was not cubist collage that he was used to from the early 20th century. This was something quite its own. It was a kind of sculptural way of drawing. It was a way of creating work that stood proud of the page, a way of creating form, colour, line all at once, and in which he could work extremely quickly with the help of his assistants at a time when he had arthritic hands, when he was aching, when he was bedridden and often in pain. In these papiers découpés works, Matisse was drawing on a number of different things that interested him. So you'll see immediately here the blue nudes. These are not just some of Matisse's most famous artworks, but some of the most recognizable, iconic works of art made in the last 100 years. You can see how that concern for the female figure, for the sort of sensuousness, for the curves of the female figure, the female form as a kind of symbol of vitality and love of life, the things that he'd explored in other prints, came to play in these cutouts. In the original, he would move his pieces of paper, coloured with gouache paint. In fact, the paint was so bright that he was often recommended by his doctors to wear thick, heavy black glasses to sort of dull their effect. He had failing eyesight in these years too, to add to his worries. And he could move about these individual pieces of paper with pins, reconfigure them until he found the form that sort of captured what he was looking for, a kind of very simple but very dynamic, very effective way of working. Dance is a constant in Matisse's career, in his life and in his work, and you can see that reoccurring in some of these blue nude forms, the kind of contortions of the body, the framing that you can get from the various limbs held in different positions, this kind of sort of idyllic Adam and Eve style figures. As he developed the cutout, they grew larger and larger, and they started to litter the walls of his studio in Vence. Unable to go out and visit and travel and explore in the way that he had done earlier in his career, he decided, no, I'm going to bring the outside world into my studio. I'm going to make of the villa in Vence a kind of paradise. This fantastic sort of earthly garden of delights he brought into his own home, asking his assistants to pin up these different cutout shapes around his house so that they spread across the walls and transformed the place into this sort of growing environment of colour and life. This is one of my favourite cutouts, and in fact the original is enormous. Again, as we said earlier, that in printmaking, Matisse found a way of taking some of those enormous works and making them more accessible to people. So this is one of them. This is La Perruche et la Sirène, the budgie and the siren. And you can see in these sort of recurring floral, almost sort of like seaweed or coral motifs, these fruit shapes, some of the designs that would recur again and again in these later cutouts. And this blue arching dancing figure, which we've seen here before. Matisse had really returned to the cutout in sort of full fervour during the years of the Second World War. And when the conflict was over, it was now time to bring this new way of working, this new medium, to the wider world. He began with a suite called Jazz, a portfolio of reproductions of his cutout designs, which brought a kind of world of happiness, of splendour and colour to 1947 France, recovering in the years after the Second World War. There were all the classic themes of Matisse's life and the things that he enjoyed. Scenes of the circus. There were acrobats, there was a sword swallower, a juggler, trapeze artists, even a white elephant balancing on its ball. But in amongst these sort of very joyous images, these sort of bright designs, sort of revelling in pure colour, there was also a recurring motif, and it's one that we see a number of times in Matisse's cutouts, and that's the image of Icarus. There are a number of different ways to interpret why Matisse might have turned to this image. On the one hand, he was now well aware of his own mortality. He was aware that in these last years of his life, fueled, almost sort of revitalized with creative passion, that he was living on borrowed time, that he did not have long to live, and that he had now to get out as much of that creative vision as he could possible. Like Icarus, flying close to the sun, knowing that the descent was near. There's also a kind of connection to the Second World War here. Matisse was sometimes criticised, unlike his friend and rival Picasso, for not engaging with politics, for not engaging with the sort of world of death and of sadness, of conflict, in the way that Picasso very obviously did. One of the things that was particularly brought against him when he revealed these cutout works was that they were childish, that they were frivolous, and they didn't have the seriousness that a grand artist really ought to. I think in some of these Icarus images there are links possibly to the Second World War. It's been noted before that this figure of Icarus almost looks like a corpse on the floor, that these stars almost look like the flashes of gunfire, of grenades and shells. But there's another thing going on here that I think you can see. This red motif here. Remember that Matisse, in those weeks after his surgery, suffered from clots in his lungs. He had that feeling of what it was like for your body to be closing down, for the kind of pain in his chest. There is a kind of self-portrait in the Jazz suite and the cutout images from this time, a kind of mirror to both the passions that he was feeling, the kind of renewed energy that he had within him, the mind that was still of a young man eager to create and to find a new way of seeing things, trapped within a body that had been riddled with its cancer and that was now recovering, bedridden, convalescing, not being able to move around in these last years of his life. From the limitations of his own health, the frailty of his own body, Matisse found a kind of liberation in this new way of working, this way of working at very quick speed, with real economy. This last chapter of Matisse's career was really all about simplicity, about getting to the very essence of things, of finding the most direct way of saying what it is that he wanted to in his work. And the cutout was perfect for that. As these cutouts began to expand in size, taking over his studio, Matisse realized that he could use this new way of working to help with some of his own commissions. He helped design a chapel in Vence, run by the nuns who had helped him in his recuperation after his surgery. The brightness of the gouache on this paper, which sort of seemed to illuminate with its colour, made it perfect for designing stained glass windows, for example. We've got a couple of those here. He was cutting the paper, cutting from colour direct, in much the way that you would to make stained glass, cutting in the glass directly. In fact, this gets to the heart of why Matisse enjoyed the cutout so much in the first place. He used to describe it as drawing in colour. Imagine you have a piece of paper or a canvas. You can make an outline. You can colour in that outline to create a form. Or with a brush, you can build up a shape from a particular colour with your brush strokes until you have that form in front of you. With these gouache sheets and a pair of heavy tailor's shears, Matisse could draw a line and create a form in one movement. It was that simplicity, that element of reduction to base elements that made the cutout so important for Matisse. These lithographic reproductions of the last cutouts are from a suite called The Last Works. This was produced in 1954. Trials of the prints of the reproductions began in 1953, and Matisse oversaw them and made a number of corrections to them. But the eventual portfolio was printed after his death at the age of 84. You can see in it some of the most iconic works from his career. We've got down here in the corner the snail, now owned by the Tate, one of the jewels in its modern art collection crown. And it's in an image like this that you can see that kind of childlike simplicity that he and his friend and rival Picasso were after, for which he was largely ridiculed at the time, but which people have now come to champion. It's also in the cutouts that you can see all of the influences from Matisse's career really coming to their culmination. You can see the inspiration that he took from his travels to Morocco, the colour of the place, the abstract patterns on the ceramic tiles. You can see the influence of illuminated folios from the medieval period. You can see the influence of the Persian rugs that he used to collect, the African sculpture that he had in his home. Even his own family history, his family were descended from a line of weavers. So finding his hands on a pair of scissors again, cutting, working with the direct line in the way that his ancestors would have, must have given him great pleasure. At first glance, some of the drawn printed work that Matisse created in these last years, the lithographic work, could not seem more different from these cutouts, but really they were getting down to the same essential basics. We've got here some drawings from a suite called 50 Dessins. This was produced again immediately after his surgery, eventually published in 1943, around the same time that he was then taking up the cutout again. In this suite, Matisse was given a commission to produce a number of drawings and to explore certain themes, certain sort of portrait styles, the kind of modelled images that he'd been working from in these later years, flower arrangements, still life, the things that are essentially Matisse. Though they might seem radically different in style, this was essentially the same subject matter in a cutout like this, the Danseuse Créole. This is an image made after Catherine Dunham, who was a very famous African-American dancer who almost created her own new style of dance, a new school of dance, in which young black female and male dancers could really take centre stage in a way that they hadn't before. This, I think, is a fantastic image. It encapsulates Matisse's love of colour, a love of colour that goes right the way back to his early roots as a fauve, as a wild beast, as they were called, for their use of colour in the sort of early 20th century. It's a fantastic image that takes the central dancer and explodes it. It captures all of that dynamic movement, that sort of fantastic, exotic quality of the movement. It's almost like a sort of firecracker or a flower coming into bloom in all its sort of richness and vitality. Though it seems much more colourful, much more dynamic than some of these drawings, essentially the drawn line is the same. It was working on a kind of simplicity, a kind of an audacity almost, trying to get to the very, very basic qualities of what it was that Matisse was drawing, and trying to fix that idea, that image, as simply and as profoundly as he could. I have here at the end of this exhibition some of the most iconic of Matisse's cutouts, the swimming pool frieze that he produced in this last chapter of his life. The story goes that Matisse was out visiting a swimming luxury resort with his assistant, and the unbearable heat, his inability to move around without being in intense pain, meant that after a few hours there, he said, I need to go home. I'm going to create my own swimming pool from the comfort of my studio in Vence. And that's precisely what he did. He, with the help of his assistants, set up large burlap panels. That's what this dark, this sort of tan brown colour represents here, with a white frieze of paper across it, to which he would cut out blue gouache paper figures, the images of figures diving in the water, of coral, of sea creatures like this starfish here, in a sort of wonderful evocation of the heat and the coolness of the water all at once. I've got here the first panel of two, and also this head section, which would have been above the doors in the room that they were established in his home. This pair of panels and this frieze that went above are all part of the collection in MoMA in New York. And in fact, in 2014, as part of a major exhibition of Matisse's cutouts, they went through conservation. And among many things that the curators saw as they worked on this piece included the pinholes in the blue pieces of paper to see how carefully they'd been moved around to make sure that the composition was exactly as Matisse wanted. You'll see from this print that there are centerfolds on some of these larger pieces. This was partly to be able to include the prints within the portfolio that they were originally published. But in fact, in a print like this, it actually mirrors the original itself. The large burlap panels have these dividing connection points. So there's rather a nice echo there between the printed work and the original. I think, though, in these swimming pool panels, there's a rather beautiful kind of melancholy almost. You can see that in Matisse, who could now no longer enjoy the sort of wonderful splendours, the niceties of youth, of young life, cavorting in the water as he once might have done. You can see a kind of longing for that world and a desire to bring all of that sort of wonderful, exotic richness and warmth into his own living space. It's rather touching, I think, that he decided to produce these works as lithographs to allow people themselves to bring these works into their own home, to bring the world of the cutout into their living space in much the same way that Matisse had done himself. The other major discovery of the conservation efforts for the original swimming pool panels was that the choice of materials has meant that they have quite severely degraded over time. The gouache has started to fade. Burlap, which is now known for its acidity, has affected the paper which was glued to it. And they've gone to great lengths to try and bring the work back to some of its original glory. That's something else that speaks to the importance of these lithographic reproductions of the cutouts. It's here where Matisse oversaw the colour corrections on these plates, where he was working hand in hand with the Moulot Frères, the magnificent printers with whom Matisse worked throughout his life, that the colour remains true to its original. It's in cutout prints like these around us that we've seen in this exhibition today that you can really experience some of the intense colour of Matisse's originals exactly as he had intended. This great outpouring of printed work in the last years of Matisse's life was born at once from exhaustion and fragility, and also an immense vitality, a creativity that he'd brought with him throughout his entire career. It's also an echo of how Matisse began his life as an artist. It was as a young boy, confined to his bed through illness, that his mother first brought him the art materials that saw him fall in love with the world of the visual image, with the world of art, of creation, which would set him on his way for the rest of his life. It was a poetic close then to his life when he died in 1954, at the age of 84, having seen some of the most extraordinary developments in art across the last 50 years of the 20th century, that Matisse's career came to a close. During that time, he had made his own contributions to that development. He had cemented his celebrity, he had cemented his reputation as one of the greats of 20th century art. For now, I will leave you as the colours of spring emerge with the wonderful vitality and creativity of Henri Matisse.